All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. The bell has rung. We do want to start with our memory verse tonight, which is taken from 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 16. So if you will recite along with me tonight. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. If you recall, last week we were studying the beginning of the conquest, the past couple of weeks, the beginning of the conquest. And we left off here with this map pretty close to the end. Jericho is located here, just above the Dead Sea. Of course, that's the first city to fall. Israel has been encamped just to the east side of that by a couple of miles at Camp Gilgal. Shortly after Jericho, they went to Ai. They had some initial difficulty, then took the city. In the process, Bethel had been helping Ai and was likewise captured, or the king at least was killed. We learned that in chapter 12 of Joshua. And then after that, they went up to Shechem, Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, where they renewed the covenant, just as Moses had given them instruction to do so. And then they returned back to Camp Gilgal. And that's where we're going to pick it up here in chapter 9. So if you will, let's go ahead and read the first 6 verses of chapter 9. Joshua 9, verse 1. And it came to pass, when all the kings who were on this side of the Jordan, this is going to be on the west side, and the hills and in the lowland and in all the coast of the great sea toward Lebanon, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite heard about it, that they gathered together to fight with Joshua and Israel with one accord. And when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they worked craftily and went and pretended to be ambassadors. And they took old sacks on their donkeys, old wineskins torn and mended, old and patched sandals on their feet, and old garments on themselves, and all the bread of their provision was dry and moldy. And they went to Joshua to the camp at Gilgal, and said to him and to the men of Israel, We have come from a far country. Now therefore make a covenant with us. So, we're opening up here, and we're again talking about the reaction of the Canaanite people. What were some of the things that they had heard about Israel up until this point? We've talked several times in the past few chapters about this. What are some of those things? Joanna?
Egypt was such a strong trading partner with everybody in the region. So they had to have known how devastating Egypt's economy had been.
Yeah, so they know that they were escaped slaves. Rahab mentioned that specifically. Jesse, your hand over here. Anybody else? Tim? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, we're talking about just a matter of weeks to months before all of this happened. So they heard the destruction of the cities and the land. Matthew?
The Jordan piling up and then them crossing over.
Yeah, remember that was 20 miles of water just stacked up. And surely that was done in the sight of all the people. Yeah. So, parting in the Red Sea, some of the things I thought of. Rahab mentions that specifically. Stephen?
Well, they talk about King Sihon and Og and what happened there on the other side of Jordan.
Yep, so the destruction of the eastern Amorite nations. That was done right before they crossed into the land, right? Moses died very shortly thereafter, and they mourned for 30 days, and then they got across. So the parting of the Jordan River, Matthew mentioned that. The destruction of Jericho, the destruction of Ai, the capture of Bethel. These are not things that were done in secret. And so the people heard about this, and we've read several times of their reactions. Chapter 2 and verse 11. As soon as we heard these things, our hearts melted. Neither did there remain any more courage in anyone because of you. For the Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and on earth below. And then in chapter 5, verse 1, when they heard about what happened and the Israelites were actually now in the land, their hearts melted, and there was no spirit in them any longer because of the children of Israel. So this is just a building of this emotion that we've been talking about, and the reaction of the Canaanite nations for God and His impending judgment coming upon them. And as anyone should, when judgment is coming upon, there should be a level of fear. right? And that was what they were experiencing here. How did the inhabitants of the Gibeon cities react? They had fear too, but they chose to do something differently.
They acted craftily to protect themselves.
Yeah, so they were going to act in a way that they saw was going to be best for their own survival. The other nations were gathering, verse 2, to fight against Joshua and Israel with one accord, so all together. Craftily was the way that Gibeon was acting here. These are cities. On this map, I have these 4 cities up here. So Gibeon was the key city of this region. And then you also have Chephirah and Beeroth and Kirjath Jearim. Beeroth, we believe, is on the other side of this river. There are some maps that put it on the same side, and then a couple other cities. So Gibeon inhabits the main part of this. These are smaller villages, and Gibeon is the big one here. It's a larger city. We read in chapter 10 and verse 2 that it was like one of the royal cities. It was greater than Ai, and all its men were mighty. So this is a key city in this region of the Promised Land. And they know there's no hope that they can win. They have no faith in their mighty men. They have no faith in the strength of their city and the size. And so they're going to act in a different way. Because of this, all these dotted lines here are roads on this map. Gibeon is located at a central point here where there's a lot of key trade between the north and the south of this section of the land. It's a really important city in this area. And so it's interesting to me, at least, that such a large city decides to do something a little bit different in terms of survival here. We're going to read over and over throughout the next couple of chapters. They're just going to fight. They're just going to fight. They're just going to fight. Gibeon's going to act differently here. This is Gibeon today. This mound here is where ancient Gibeon was. And again, it was a pretty large city compared certainly to Ai. Ai we know was small. It's not the largest city they're going to come against, but it was a big one, the biggest one up until this point, located here. What were God's instructions regarding the other nations?
Utterly destroy them.
Yep. Make no covenants with the people of Canaan. Destroy them completely. Could they make covenants with people? In general.
Well, in general, they could.
Okay.
These people, because they were nearby, they were in the land that they were inheriting, but there was something else about people that were far away.
Mm-hmm.
They could make cause them to pay them tribute if they came to them in peace and that kind of thing.
Yeah, so if you go to Deuteronomy 20 and verse 10, Moses gave some instruction for that. When you go near a city to fight against it, then proclaim an offer of peace to it. And it shall be that if they accept your offer of peace and open to you, then all the people who are found in it shall be placed under tribute to you and serve you. Now if the city will not make peace with you, but war against you, then you shall besiege it. And when the Lord your God delivers it into your hands, you shall strike every male in it with the edge of the sword. But the women and the little ones, the livestock, and all those in the city, all the spoils, you shall plunder for yourself. And you shall eat the enemy's plunder, which the Lord your God gives you. Thus you shall do to all the cities which are very far from you, which are not of the cities of these nations. So God gave very clear directions in the land of promise that he is giving them. They need to be gone. Wipe them out completely. If it's somebody from far away and you go up against them and fight them, the options are they surrender or you destroy the men and you place everybody else into servitude. Which category did Gibeon fall under? First one. There should have been no situation where the Israelites were going to make a covenant with these people. But because Gibeon was going to act craftily, we see they fall into some difficulty here. Let's continue reading in chapter 9 of Joshua and verse 7. Then the men of Israel said to the Hivites, these are the people of Gibeon, perhaps you dwell among us, so how can we make a covenant with you? But they said to Joshua, we are your servants. And Joshua said to them, who are you, and where do you come from? So they said to him, from a very far country your servants have come. because of the name of the Lord your God, for we have heard of his fame and all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon, king of Heshbon, and Og, king of Bashan, who was at Ashtaroth. Therefore our elders and all the inhabitants of our country spoke to us, saying, Take provisions with you for the journey, and go to meet them, and say to them, We are your servants. Now therefore make a covenant with us. This bread of ours we took hot for our provision from our houses on the day we departed to come to you. But now look, it is dry and moldy. And these wineskins which we filled were new, and see, they are torn, and these our garments and our sandals have become old because of the very long journey. Then the men of Israel took some of their provisions, but they did not ask counsel of the Lord. So Joshua made peace with them, and made a covenant with them to let them live, and the rulers of the congregation swore to them. So the Gibeonites here come and seek peace. What's the reaction of the people and of Joshua initially? They were skeptical, rightfully so, as they should have been, right? The Gibeonites gave them evidence, if you will, of their truth. They showed them moldy bread. They showed them old wineskins. They showed them worn out clothes. But could they validate their story in any way? Any actual evidence, a map, or any of these sorts of things saying, yes, this is true? Or was it all circumstantial? Yeah, there was no way they could have proven it. There's also some interesting things here I find that they say in verse 9. What are some of those things, verse 9 and 10? What are some of those things that they say to support their claims and maybe entice the Israelites to listen to them?
They want to get to know their God better.
They want to know their God better, right? There's words of flattery that are said here, right? Because of the name your God and because of his fame and all he did in Egypt and to the Amorites on the other side of the Jordan. They speak to this, and it's enticing to the people based on the events that they've heard about. Do they speak of any recent events? Jericho, Ai? No, they're talking about events that occurred months ago. Things they might have heard at the beginning of their journey, but they haven't heard anything since. They're very smart about the things they're going to talk about and the things they're not going to talk about too. Compare this to the statements of Rahab in chapter 2. Some of the words are similar, right? Verse 9, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and the terror of you has fallen on us, and all the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of you. For we heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. Verse 12, now therefore I beg you, swear to me by the Lord, since I have shown you kindness, that you will show me kindness to my father's house, and give me a true token, and spare my father, my mother, my brothers, my sisters, all that I have, and deliver our lives from death. What's the difference between these two statements?
Rahab was pretty specific.
In what way?
She knew about the events, and she named them. Maybe I'm naive, but I don't know how much, I don't know how you could prove that you were not from a foreign country.
Correct.
But the kicker is, and you're probably going to get to this already, but in verse 14, they didn't ask counsel of the Lord.
Yeah, that's the difference, right? That is all they needed to do in order to do that. We are going to get to that in just a moment. Anybody else have anything about Rahab and the Gibeonite reactions here? Ben. Okay, yeah.
Deuteronomy 7, what are your thoughts? Because in verse 3, he says, destroy them utterly. And then in verse 3, he says, furthermore, you should not intermarry with them. So why give them that direction if everyone's to be destroyed utterly? Wouldn't Deuteronomy 20 fit into that as well, with the women and the children could be, they could be spared if there was peace? And we already have that example too with Rahab and her family being spared. So I was just curious what your thoughts on that.
So Yeah, I think that's a great point. So my take on this in chapter 7 is we're not talking about the nations from afar. We're talking about the nations that are in the land. Destroy them completely. God knows they're not going to be destroyed completely at this point. He knows they're going to fall short for a period of time. He knows they're going to be tempted. He knows that there's going to be a thorn that's going to be placed in their side when they continue to do that. And so he's outlining, hey, destroy them completely. If you don't, here are some terrible things that are going to happen afterwards. Yes, also I think 8, don't make intermarried with the people you do make covenants with. Put them in servitude, don't elevate them to a position of equalness in terms of marriage and relationships and all those sorts of things. That's how I take that. Do you take that differently? Or anybody else have a comment on that?
Yeah, maybe I just missed with the how far away the people were. I'm in agreement that utterly they were to wipe out Joshua 23. Otherwise they're going to cling. But they also had some provisions like Deuteronomy 20 where not everyone would, not utterly, it was not always like a total annihilation because there's still women and children around.
Yeah. So the people far away here in Deuteronomy 20, to me, is anybody outside the land. That's how I take that, because he's very specific at the beginning. And in that passage, I think it's in verse 14, utterly destroy everybody in this land. I'm not turned to it specifically, so the phrasing I may be a little off.
Canaanites in general.
Uh-huh.
Yes, right. So I agree with you. It's their inheritance. I do think that in chapter 7 of Deuteronomy it says that it's reinforcing his idea that, hey, it's got to be complete. I don't want you to intermarry with. I don't want you to just kill the guys and intermarry with them. I think it just validates the fact, or reinforces the fact that it's a complete destruction.
Yeah, we've talked about in lessons past, like in Jericho, for example, or Ai, where they're going in and they're destroying the men and the women and the children, and how hard that might have been for some of these men who were nomadic. And now they're going in there and they're just killing everybody, all the people, regardless of age, gender, didn't matter. But he's outlining dangers associated with them failing to enact that. And out of all the people that in my mind anyway, that they may be tempted to save, it would be the women, it would be the children. And there's dangers with falling into that trap as well. Yeah. Anybody else? So back to what we were talking about with Rahab. I see here a difference in sincerity and motivation. Rahab seeks salvation for herself and her family. The Gibeonites are seeking to trick and to deceive. They're coming from two different places. The Gibeonites are not sincere in their desire to come to know the Lord, your God, in verse 9. Rahab was. And so that made all the difference. Why were the people deceived? We kind of talked about this already. Verse 14, one thing is they looked at the provisions. Yes, Matthew.
I don't know that I would say the Gibeonites weren't sincere in coming to want to know the Lord, because they're essentially making a treaty with Israel where Israel is going to be the suzerain and they'll be the vassal, which ancient treaties like that probably meant the Gibeonites would have adopted worship of the Lord. The difference is they weren't giving up anything out, their other worship. Whereas Rahab was giving up everything to join Israel. The Gibeonites, they were trying to deceive them, and they probably would adopt the worship of the Lord, but they weren't going to give up other practices.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's fair. Don't know their motivations, right? But their desire was to trick them in this moment. Rahab was sincere in her desire to save her family at this point. It's a great point. Okay, the people of Israel were deceived because, first of all, they looked at the provisions. So they were tricked by what they saw. But the kicker is, as Hugh pointed out, they failed to counsel the Lord. Why did this make the difference?
You're not going to trick the Lord.
God has all the answers. All they had to do was ask. There was no way, to your point earlier, that they could have proven, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that they were from a far nation. God knew where they were from. All they had to do was ask, and they failed to do that. It's really sad, because we've been talking about their victories up to this point, and they just renewed the covenant at Shechem on Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, and talked about the blessings of following God and the cursings of failing to follow God. And they come back here, and shortly after are deceived into not following God at this point. I'm behind in my notes. Is this any different? How can we avoid making the same mistakes in our lives today?
Well, what you mentioned about they saw the provisions kind of makes me think about Achan too. He saw, he coveted, he took, and there's wisdom taking a step back and seeing what does God have to say about this in His Word. And we can turn to the Scriptures for the wisdom. We can ask the wisdom for Him as well before making a hasty vow or promise.
Yeah. So always go to the source, right? The evidence that the Gibeonites presented appeared to be factual and sound, and even sometimes when we're presented with decisions that we believe to be right, based on all the evidence that we see, we need to pause for a moment and really slow down, and not be hasty, and make sure that we are seeking the truth in God's Word before we act. Yeah. Stephen?
I don't see here where they took a lot of time
Mm-hmm.
in the decision either. It just seemed like it was, okay, let's go ahead and do this. There was a period of, maybe we ought to think about this, or let's vet this out, or let them stay with us, let's get to know them better. There wasn't a lot of prudence in that way, it didn't seem like.
Yeah, they certainly didn't pause to think at all. Any indication here? They just saw, they took some of the provisions, so they took it at what the word of what they presented it as, and just made peace with him in verse 15. We got to slow down. We got to be willing to suss out the details, get a feel for what the truth is. You can't get that based on a quick meeting. Ben?
Maybe a little bit of a stretch, but thinking about when two people decide to get married, there's great wisdom in taking your time. Do I really know this person? I'm making a promise for death do you part. So there's some wisdom there with some of the more practical things that we may do.
Yeah. How many people have been bit by making hasty decisions, and then they're stuck with the consequences, as is the case here, right? They made a covenant with these people. God expects them to fulfill that covenant. And so they do, but the Gibeonites are there, and we see them spread out through the Old Testament in the days of the kings. I also think of the subtlety of the devil, and how oftentimes, he will present to us things that seem good and right on the surface. It's not obvious, and sometimes we got to dig a little bit to find the truth of the matter. God has given us all the tools we need to do that, but we've got to use them. And if we fail to use them, we're going to fall into the similar traps.
He had told them back in Deuteronomy and other places not to show the people mercy. And sometimes we can confuse things and think, something tugs at my heartstrings, and follow my feeling about something, or, hey, this is good to show mercy. That was against what God told me to do. Even though it may have felt like, wait a minute, I need to show mercy to these people. No, you cannot.
Yeah. God gave them very clear direction, and failure to follow it is not mercy. He was enacting judgment upon these people. But from the standpoint of the Israelites, they've been fighting. Oh, finally somebody we can have peace with, right? But it wasn't God what God wanted. Yeah. Anybody else? You.
Do we place the blame here, for lack of a better term, on Joshua?
Well,
I know the people seem to have some sway, But it says that he made the decision to make peace with them in verse 15 that you haven't read yet.
Yeah. Joshua was the ultimate one who made that decision. Yeah.
Ultimately, he was the one that was supposed to ask questions of the priest from the Lord. Back in Numbers, it says that's what one of his roles was, to inquire of the Lord.
Yeah, and he failed to do that here. Yeah, the ultimate blame lies on all of them, but Joshua bears some blame. Did I hear? Yes.
So it's ironic to me that we refer to them as the children of Israel, because they act like children, right? In a lot of it, right? God gave them specific instructions. I give my boys specific instructions. And the outcome is often not at all what was expected. And so I think, to answer your question about how do we overcome it or stay out of those traps, is we mature in our faith. We continue to study. We continue to grow. And we continue to work at it. And I'm sure that my boys won't be making the same mistakes a year, 2 years, 3 years down the road. The same way that the Israelites were going to learn from those mistakes and grow in their faith. But they're going to have to pay the consequences. You know, you didn't do what you're told to do, you still got to do it. So.
Right. And we see that growth here, right? We see Joshua's failure here. He asked them some initial questions in verse 8. Then he did not seek counsel of the Lord in verse 14. Verse 15, he made peace with them. And then we get into chapter 10, and God, he's learning from his mistakes, and God is leading him back into battle. At the end of chapter 10, verse 40, so Joshua conquered all the land, the mountain country of the south, the lowland, the wilderness slopes, all the kings. He left none remaining, and utterly destroyed all that breathed, as the Lord God of Israel had commanded. Joshua here doesn't wallow in his failure. He recognizes that he did something he was not supposed to do. At the end of chapter 9, he tries to mitigate some of the consequences of that, but he owns that mistake, and he moves forward with God's mercy and the leadership of the people. There's a growth lesson here that we need to learn too. Yeah, great comment. Anybody else before we move on? Okay, let's go ahead and read verse 16 through the end. And it happened at the end of 3 days, after they had made a covenant with them, that they heard that they were neighbors who dwelt near them. Then the children of Israel journeyed and came to the cities on the 3rd day. Now their cities were Gibeon, Caraphah, Beeroth, and Kirjath-jearim. And the children of Israel did not attack them, because the rulers of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord God of Israel. And all the congregation complained against the rulers. Then all the rulers said to all the congregation, "We have sworn to them by the Lord God of Israel. Now, therefore, we may not touch them. This we will do to them. We will let them live, lest wrath be upon us because of the oath which we swore to them." And the rulers said to them, "Let them live, but let them be woodcutters and water carriers for all the congregation, as the rulers had promised them." Then Joshua called for them, and he spoke to them, saying, "Why have you deceived us, saying, 'We are from very far from you,' when you dwell near us? Now therefore you are cursed, and none of you shall be free from being slaves, woodcutters and water carriers for the house of my God." So they answered Joshua and said, "Because your servants were clearly told that the Lord your God commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land, and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land from before you, therefore we were very much afraid for our lives because of you, and have done this thing. And now here we are, in your hands. Do with us as it seems good and right to do to us." So he did to them, and delivered them out of the hands of the children of Israel, so that they did not kill them. And that day Joshua made them woodcutters and water carriers for the congregation and for the altar of the Lord, in the place which he would choose, even to this day. Okay, so what was done after the deception was found out?
They honored their agreement.
Yeah, so they marched there upon the city, and Joshua placed them into servitude in honor of their agreement. They didn't go back. Why would that have been a problem? Why did they have to honor their agreement?
Because of the law says.
Yeah, God expects them to keep their word. Joshua had to be a man of integrity here. And he was setting this expectation. Deuteronomy 23, 23. That which has gone from your lips you shall keep and perform, for you voluntarily vowed for the Lord your God that you have promised with your mouth. God expects them to keep their word. And so they had to do that here, even though it meant letting these people live there. Did that mean that they were just going to be able to wander around and do whatever they wanted to do? No, God placed them into servitude here. It's interesting that to me anyway, they use this excuse in verse 9. They wanted to get to know the Lord your God. And so Joshua gives them a duty, serving God in the house, right? So the tabernacle and later the temple, gathering wood, gathering water. The altar fire required a lot of wood to keep going. And so they were responsible for that. The animals that were going to be offered on that altar had to be washed with water. Gibeonites were responsible for that. They were placed into servanthood to serve God, the God that they claimed initially that they wanted to get to know. Whether that was in earnest or not, it doesn't seem to be anyway, but they sure got to know God, right, by serving him directly. And so that was their penalty for this. Any thoughts or comments before we move on to chapter 10? Joanna?
Seriously, God takes covenants, even though it very clearly made a mess for the Gibeonites, it made a mess for Israel, and it violated God's plans for everything else down the road. It doesn't matter. He takes the covenant seriously.
Yeah. Is the expectation any different today? No. Ephesians 4:25, put away all lying. Let each one of you speak truth to his neighbor, for we are members of one another. God's expectation is the same today as it was back then. We need to be people of our word. When we tell someone we're going to do something, we need to do that thing. And God expects that, even when sometimes that may cause us a problem because we're speaking rashly or impulsively or however it is that we're doing. Matthew.
It's interesting, after this chapter 11, verse 20, when it's talking about the conquest, it says, "Fruit was of the Lord to harden their hearts, that they should come against Israel in battle, and that he might utterly destroy them, and that they might receive no mercy, and that he might destroy them, as the Lord had commanded Moses." So it seems like God is kind of allowing Israel to be tested with the Gibeonites, which is a little interesting. They seem to be a little different than the other Canaanites. They're not listed in some of those lists specifically of people they're supposed to destroy.
Well, they're Hivites.
They're Hivites.
Yeah.
All the other cities seem to have kings. The Gibeonites are a little different. They have elders that are leading them. And again, I think they are willing to worship the Lord. Probably not getting rid of all their other gods too, but they are essentially willing to enter servitude to Israel and the Lord.
Yeah, as long as they're living, right? Their ultimate goal was to live through this conquest. And so they got to do that. They're still alive in the days of Saul. They're still there. In fact, Saul went out to destroy them and brought a plague upon the house of Israel because he was violating this covenant that Joshua made with them. God wanted them to live up to their words, right? And so they got to do that. They got to enter into this servanthood position because of their willingness to do that. Okay, let's move on to chapter 10. We're not going to read much of 10. I do want to start with the first few verses, though. Now it came to pass when Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, heard how Joshua had taken Ai and had utterly destroyed it, as he had done to Jericho and his king, as he had done to Ai and his king, and how the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were among them, that they feared greatly because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all its men were mighty. Therefore, Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, sent to Hoam, king of Hebron, Piram, king of Jarmuth, Jephthah, king of Lachish, and Debir, king of Eglon, saying, "Come up to me and help me, that we may attack Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and with the king of Israel." So, how did the surrounding Amorite nations react to the treaty between Gibeon and Israel?
I thought Gibeon was like turncoats, so they're gonna punish them for it.
Yep. They They're formed an alliance. Initially, we're talking about this alliance in chapter 9, right? They all came together, verse 2, with one accord to fight against Joshua and Israel. Now they've turned their attention away from Joshua onto Gibeon. So we have these nations here. These are the cities that were mentioned specifically in this region down here. And so they all amassed nations, armies, and they sent them up to attack Gibeon here to the north. And so they surround them, or rather they're before the gates in verse 5 and make war against it. How did Gibeon respond? They sent word to their new allies, right? So they sent word to Joshua. Joshua amasses an army and goes forward and attacks this alliance here. Again, because he's a man of integrity and God expects them to keep their word. They made a covenant, and so God wanted them to fulfill that. How did Israel win the battle with the Amorite alliance? The Lord killed them. Absolutely. How do you do that? Yeah. So the Lord routed the people, verse 10, before Israel and killed them with a great slaughter at Gibeon. And these are the people are chasing them down the road as far as Azekah and Makkedah. And it happened as they fled before Israel. They were on the descent of Beth Horon, that the Lord cast down great hailstones from heaven on them as far as Achaia, and they died. And there were more who died from the hailstones than the children of Israel killed with the sword. Who did this battle belong to? The Lord. Make no mistake, this was not Joshua's victory. Yes, they killed some people, but God did the work, right? And so we are on this map here. And so they're fighting up here. The Lord routs them. This is the valley of Beth Horon here. There's a couple of villages in here, Beth Horon. This is a key road. And Joshua chases them all the way down to Azekah while they are being pelted by these hailstones. And they die, right? Do they all die on the way? Who escapes? The kings. Yep. And so the kings come down to the south and lodge here outside Makkedah, inside a cave. They're hiding. These mighty kings of these Canaanite nations are cowering in a cave to go away from the hailstones and the God that also stopped the sun and the moon and the sky at the request of Joshua so they could continue fighting. These people were terrified. Joshua, in the meantime, doesn't know about the kings, returns to Gilgal. Word comes to him in verse 17. The 5 kings have been found, hidden in a cave at Makkedah. So Joshua said, roll large stones against the mouth of the cave and set men by it to guard them. But don't stay there yourselves. Pursue your enemies and attack their rear guard. Don't let them enter their cities, for the Lord your God has delivered them into their hands. As Joshua continues fighting and returns to fight those kings. Verse 22, Joshua commanded the cave to be opened up. They brought all the kings out. They put them on the ground. They put their feet on their necks. They killed them with the sword. They hung them until nightfall. And then at nightfall, they tossed them back in the cave, rolled a stone over it, and they let them stay there and until this very day, verse 27, so at the time of this writing. Does Joshua stop at this point? Is he done fighting? No. So at this point, he then moves against Makkedah here. Right there, and they sack and destroy Makkedah. This is in verse 28. Verse 29, from there, he moves on to Libnah, and he attacks that city. From there, verse 31 and 32, he moves south to Lachish and attacks it, destroys the city, captures the city, rather. These are capturings, not destructions. In the north here, in Gezer, the king here hears about this, and so he amasses an army and sends it down to attack in Lachish. And of course, Joshua's victorious here as well. From here, he moves in verse 34 and 35 to attack Eglon. He captures that city. From there, he moves on to Hebron in 36 and 37. and captures that one too. From there, in verses 38 and 39, he moves south to Debir. He captures that city. He's moving. He is busy. He is doing what God is asking him to do. That's not all he does. There are a number of cities here in the south. If you look at verse 40, so Joshua conquered all the land, the mountain country in the south. There's several cities that are listed in chapter 12. Hamorah, Arid, Adullam, Geter. They're all listed as being captured and destroyed. Their kings killed in the chapter 12 here. We also talk about the kings of Jarmuth here and Gezer being killed. We're not mentioned specifically of the cities themselves being captured, but it's reasonably to assume that they were. When you factor in also the fact that we have taken the king of Jerusalem, the king of Jarmuth, Gezer, the king of Bethel, Ai's been burned, Jericho's been burned, Joshua's been busy. He's doing in verse 40, as the Lord God had commanded him, utterly destroying all that breathed, he left none remaining. Joshua is doing the will of God. Yes, he made mistakes with the Gibeonites, but he's moved on from that, and now he's busy out doing everything God is telling him to do. And he's capturing in all of this region. These are little blips on the map. If you look at the actual verses here, verses 37, they took it and struck it with the edge of the sword as king. All his cities, all the people that were in it, he left none remaining. These are cities, and they are surrounding villages, in the way that Gibeon is a city and a surrounding allied villages. So Eglon here, for example, was a city and then surrounding villages. He's not just attacking cities, he's taking territory. This is the land the people have been promised, the farms they didn't build, the vineyards they didn't plant, the cities they didn't build. God is giving them what he has been promising them for centuries. And so now this is coming to fruition here. Any comments on this chapter 10? Matthew.
So we talked about with Jericho, how the Israelites didn't have siege equipment. Here, God is resorting to a different strategy. First off, he's inciting all these kings to come face them out in the open field. And then when they start running, God helps make sure they don't make it back to the cities, so that when Joshua gets to all these cities, they're not really defended very heavily.
Yeah, so God has a battle plan, and he's putting it into place. Stephen.
The magnitude of the sun standing still. It's never happened before. It's never happened since. But just that is so powerful. And it's just a smidge. He created it all anyway. But just that whole, however he accomplished that is amazing.
But yes, the actual miracle itself is absolutely amazing. But it happened why?
So he could continue fighting.
What caused it to happen?
The request.
Joshua prayed. Yeah, Joshua was willing to pray to God and ask. Something he didn't do in chapter 9, right? But in chapter 10, he's learned and he's gone to God for a request and help. And God grants it to him. It's amazing. It's a lesson for us that even when, Joshua was asking for the impossible at this point, but he wasn't afraid to ask. Sometimes do we sell God's power short and think, oh, that's not something that is possible. That thing can't happen. I'm not even going to bother God with it. Ask. There is no harm in asking. God's willing to bless us if we just seek him first. Yeah, great point. Anybody else? Dorothy.
Joshua's always been Tim's hero. He made a mistake, but he moved on from it. And we have to do the same thing when we mess up. We need to pray, repent, and move on.
Yeah, there's mercy. God is ready to give us mercy. We just need to ask him for it. And Joshua received it here, and he went back to leading the people as he was given his job to do. Yeah, excellent. Last word. And there's a bell. Bell has the last word. Okay, we'll pick it up here in chapter 11 next week. Thank you all.